So this is Imran. Imran is a wheelchair user. He is a post-polio affectee. And like many other persons with disabilities in Pakistan, when Imran was born and he got polio, his family was very concerned about the future of Imran, how he'll be able to get education, how Imran will be able to interact with his friends, how Imran will be able to go out of his home. So all these challenges were there with the family of Imran. So, but they have one thing in common, that they thought if Imran would be able to get good education, he can change his destiny. And Imran had this thing in his mind since childhood. So Imran completed his first grade, second, third, fourth, fifth, and he was really excited to go in the 6th grade. But he got to know that his class, which was in the ground floor, has shifted to 1st floor. So all the dreams were shattered in just one day. And since there was no accessible school near his locality, so Imran was bound to leave his education altogether. So like Imran, there are like 15% of Pakistan's population consists of people with disabilities. And out of those, 90% are people who can't go to school. And the global literacy rate for adults, people with disabilities is 3%, and it's just 1% for women with disabilities. And if we apply the above statistics to Pakistan, 15%, it makes the population of Pakistan, person with disabilities in Pakistan, more than the combined population of Karachi and Islamabad. So we wanted to understand what are the causes that create stories like Imran, and why people with disabilities are not part of mainstream. Although the population is so great, but we hardly see people with disabilities in mainstream society, doing jobs, in schools and all. So we wanted to analyze what are the causes. So we analyzed both the supply side, people with disabilities, what were the problems there, and the demand side, the employers, the government and all. So understand what are the challenges. So we did a study in which we reached out to 1,652 young persons with disabilities across Pakistan from 17 districts, and they were like from the ages of 15 to 24. And they were primarily doing their education or have completed their education. They were like being employed somewhere, or like they were seeking employment. From the supply side, we reached out to government representatives, employers, NGOs, DPOs, service providers like special schools, general schools and vocational training centers. And there were like 5 areas that we identified where the actual problem occurs. The first one is the statistics. The population of people with disabilities in Pakistan according to the 98 census was 2.34%. But the same population in 2017 shrunk to 0.48%. It's normally, we were assuming that this census would increase the population of people with disabilities, but there were many challenges because when the census data was being collected, there wasn't a question about disabilities in the survey. So it was after the Supreme Court ruling that this question was added. So in some pockets it was added, and some pockets it wasn't added. So this population is the first barrier that they face is the statistics. Even for a small family, if you're planning the budget, you need to know the number of people in the house to plan a budget. But we have a population of people with disabilities and we don't know how many people with disabilities are there. So normally we follow the international figures, WHO 15% of the population of persons with disabilities in Pakistan. So 71% of the person with disabilities are unemployed, and Pakistan loses a massive amount of its GDP by excluding people with disabilities. And inclusion of people with disabilities is not beneficial for people with disabilities themselves. It's beneficial for the government, it's beneficial for the society in general, because you have to spend less on the social programs. So although we have like signed international treaties like UNCRPD, there are policies in place, there is a quota system in place. For Sindh it's 5%, for Punjab it's 3%, for KPK it's 2%, and for Balochistan it's 5%. But it's hardly implemented. There are policies. Last year there was extensive a policy made for people with disabilities, Empowerment for Persons with Disabilities Act 2018, which is comprehensive, but there are very few things that normally implement. So the implementation process is a big challenge. Again, legislation, there are things on place, but हमने लोगों से आम तौर पे बात किया, they said कि सारी किताबों में तो ज़रूर लिखी गई है, बातों में भी स्पीच के अंदर नज़र आती है, लेकिन जब इम्प्लीमेंट करते हैं तो हार्डली कोई ऐसी चीज़ नज़र आती है. So we analyze that you must have seen बहुत सारे लोगों के भाई बहन बच्चे या फिर इस तरीके से they are in schools and they can see there are hardly people, children with disabilities in school. If there are few, they are in very small numbers comparative to their population. So we analyzed that why this happens. So this number one thing is lack of awareness. People hardly know. If you ask any person with disabilities what are the accessible schools in Pakistan, in Karachi, they hardly have any information about that. Inaccessibility is the biggest barrier. Normally people understand that installing a ramp is enough for people with disabilities, but there are many things associated with it, making a place accessible. There are lack of options and many problems. The one important factor that we got out of this was the quality of education that people with disabilities received at their special school is not up to the mark. We interviewed a colleague, he told I was studying at a blind school and I was really excited, I was getting good grades, I had great expectations about the future. But when I graduated and I went to my university in mainstream setup, I was amazed that the level of education that I had was not up to the mark, and he had to do many struggle in that process. Although people with disabilities, I earlier mentioned that adults with disabilities are 3% literacy rate unme hota hai, but there are 99% with disabilities that we got to know that they understand, they know that academic qualification is important for them to get good employment. And interestingly, we normally talk that people with disabilities prefer inclusive setup, but all the people that we interviewed, majority of them told us that they prefer special school. And 72% of the young person with disabilities say that inaccessibility, infrastructural inaccessibility is the biggest challenge that they face in employment and education. And only 4% of the young people with disabilities have a master's or bachelor's degree in Pakistan. Or the earlier point that I mentioned, why people usually prefer special school is due to the environment inside a usual school. We met many individuals. उसके अंदर से एक quote हमें यह आया था कि there was a mother who used to say कि मेरा बच्चा पहले जाता था आम schools के अंदर, लेकिन he faced many challenges. People used to make fun of my kid, and that's the reason he's more towards people who are like him. तो ये ज़्यादा preference, you will see people with hearing disabilities and other kind of disabilities being in their own group. So this is something that is there. So 97% of the respondents, so what we did in this report, it's mentioned, and we analyzed the kind of skills which are offered in Pakistan and the kind of skills that people with disabilities want for themselves and the kind of skills which have more market value. So there is all the skill mapping that we have done. It's quite lengthy, you can check out in the report. But 97% of people with disabilities told us that vocational training is something that they can undergo and they can have their chances of getting employment better. And there was a feedback from the representatives of people of vocational training centers that you need to design programs at vocational training centers which are fine for people with disabilities and which has market relevance as well. Because normally what it's been seen that आम तौर पे stereotype बड़ा कर दिया जाता है with different kind of disabilities. For example, if a person is a wheelchair user, so family would think that he is good for stitching. If a person with visual impairment, people would say he is good with call center. या फिर वो मदरसे के अंदर बना दिया, मदरसे के अंदर भेज दिया जाता है. If a person with hearing speech disability, so normally graphic designing, art और इस तरह की चीज़ों में भेज दिया जाता है. So this is usually seen in special schools, vocational training centers and all. So this can be changed based on the market demands and the kind of interest that people with disabilities have themselves. And we analyze that since although Sindh has 5% quota already discussed, but hardly any person with disabilities get placed in mainstream organization based on this quota, 6% only. And the biggest barrier that they face is accessibility, quality. As I already mentioned, the quality of education, although they have bachelors, they have masters, but the kind of education that people with disabilities usually have is not comparative to other people without disabilities. वो stamp तो लग जाता है bachelor's का इस तरह से, लेकिन there are various challenges. So, and there was one biggest factor that people hardly know about any organization. There is no information available in place that how people with disabilities can go to organizations which are accessible, which accept people with disabilities. So based on this thing, we analyzed what are the kind of things that can be done to improve the condition of people with disabilities. At NOWPDP, one of our primary work is for the inclusion of people with disabilities through economic empowerment. So what we do is, our team of Institute of, we have a four-pronged approach of making an organization disability friendly. We go to organizations with Institute of Architects. We make this organization and we recommend them the infrastructural changes required. And then we train, sensitize people with disabilities, and we sensitize staff. And then we improve the policies. And once this is done, we place people with disabilities. Initially, what we used to do was we used to identify employers and we used to identify person with disabilities, and we were like just matching it. So what used to happen was people in excitement and due to their CSR initiatives used to place them. And then once they were placed, they were not having information that how to make use of these resources. So this is required. So government intervention is the must thing. Although the 5% quota is there, but there should be some kind of enforcement, and there should be some kind of studies to identify what kind of skills people with disabilities should have, and these skills should be there in our vocational training centers. Data I already expressed, improvement in quality education, and dual sensitization session I already discussed. It's not just for people without disabilities. People with disabilities need to change a bit as well. They have to understand the kind of requirement. They have to understand कि mainstream के अंदर क्या चल रहा है. They need to get themselves good education, and both तरफ से expectation management is required. And the biggest thing is that physical infrastructure is necessary to make organization inclusive for people with disabilities. So I initially discussed the story of Imran. Imran couldn't continue his education, but Imran had other ways. Imran continued his vocational training. Imran got an expert technician, became an expert technician in motorcycle mechanics and rickshaw. And Imran is working at NOWPDP. He has made the first accessible rickshaw, which is completely hand controlled. He drives this rickshaw, and he has made other people with disabilities drove this rickshaw. So he's not just making himself employed, he is encouraging other people with disabilities to become employed and see the opportunities are there. So that story tells us that although the situation is not up to the mark,